April 7, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. Dawn breaks over the Japanese home islands as 91 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approach their rendezvous point. In the cockpit of his Mustang, Major James B. Tapp grips the control stick, his 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The early model P-51Ds carry 500 rounds for each inboard gun and 270 for the center and outboard positions, a total of 2,080 rounds. Later variants would reduce this to 400 rounds per inboard gun for improved reliability, bringing the total to 1,880 rounds. Below, Mount Fuji stands out against the clear morning sky, unmistakable in its majesty, its snow-capped peak serving as a navigation point that pilots would use throughout the mission. The morning sun casts long shadows across the Japanese countryside, revealing a patchwork of rice fields, villages, and military installations that had never before seen American fighters. The mission is unprecedented. Escort B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland from a base 750 miles away, a distance that military planners just 2 years earlier had deemed impossible for single-engine fighters. At 0700 hours, more than 100 Japanese interceptors converge on the American formation. Through the morning haze comes a sight that shocks Japanese pilots to their core. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo, something their commanders had assured them was impossible. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. These are not carrier-based Navy fighters with limited range, but land-based Army Air Force fighters that have somehow crossed 750 miles of open ocean to appear over the Imperial capital. Leading the Japanese defense are pilots flying the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, the Frank, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, alongside older Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shokis, Ki-61 Hyans, and Navia 6 M0s, and N1K2-J Shitens. The Ki-84 could outclimb and outmaneuver both the P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at certain altitudes and speeds. What happens next will demonstrate the vast technological gulf between two nations' approaches to air warfare, and reveal why American industrial might had produced what many pilots would call the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The North American P-51D Mustang had arrived in the Pacific Theater with a reputation already forged in the skies over Europe, where it had broken the back of the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing of Germany possible. Developed initially for export to Britain, models modified by the British to use Rolls-Royce Merlin engines became America's most capable wartime fighters. The transformation from the Allison-powered early variants to the Merlin-powered masterpiece represented one of aviation's most successful international collaborations, a marriage of American aerodynamic innovation and British engine technology. The pairing of the legendary Merlin engine and the P-51 Mustang eventually resulted in the P-51D, which provided the U.S. Army Air Forces with a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range fighter that could escort heavy bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, and now, incredibly, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. The Packard 5 1650-7 engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection, rising to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war power settings. This two-stage, two-speed supercharged power plant could maintain high performance at altitudes where Japanese engines gasped for air. their single-stage superchargers unable to compress the thin atmosphere sufficiently. The P-51D flew to a maximum speed of about 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, reached an operating ceiling of almost 42,000 feet, and was armed with 6 wing-mounted 0.50-inch M2 Browning machine guns. The mathematics of firepower were devastating and precisely calculated. 6 M2 Browning machine guns firing at 800 rounds per minute. Each meant the P-51D could deliver 4,800 rounds per minute of concentrated firepower, 80 rounds per second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and travelled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering tremendous kinetic energy on impact, capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and destroying engines with just a few well-placed hits. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons of the US 8th Air Force in Europe were composed of Mustangs, a testament to the aircraft's superiority over all other available fighters. This massive production and deployment reflected American industrial capacity at its peak, with assembly lines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas were producing P-51s at a rate that staggered the imagination. At peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. By war's end, 15,586 P-51s of all variants would be manufactured, with the D model alone accounting for 8,156 aircraft, more than Japan's total production of all fighter types in the last 2 years of the war combined. The very long-range capability that brought Mustangs to Tokyo represented a revolution in fighter operations that changed the fundamental mathematics of air warfare. With dual 110-gallon drop tanks, Mustangs could fly round trips of 1,500 statute miles as a matter of routine, though pilots would push this to 1,600 miles when necessary. This was equivalent to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine aircraft with no alternate landing sites except the ocean. The key to this achievement lay in the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel efficiency at cruise settings, consuming just 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise, combined with the P-51's laminar flow wing design that reduced drag by 35% compared to conventional airfoils. The laminar flow wing, developed by North American's aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood, maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface, delaying the transition to turbulent flow and dramatically reducing parasitic drag. Standing in stark contrast was the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, which entered operational service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944, too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Named Gale and designated by the Allies as Frank, this fighter represented Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority with what resources remained to the embattled empire. The Ki-84 is generally considered the best Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the conflict. Though large numbers was relative, what Japan considered mass production, America would consider prototype runs. The aircraft boasted high speed and excellent maneuverability with an armament of up to 230mm Ho-155 cannons and 220mm Ho-5 cannons that gave it formidable firepower, on paper. The reality was more complex. The 30mm cannons carried only 50 rounds per gun, the 20mm cannons just 150 rounds per gun, giving a total ammunition load of just 400 rounds compared to the Mustang's 1,880 to 2,080 rounds. On paper, the Ki-84 appeared competitive, even superior in some respects. It was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Homar 18-cylinder radial engine, a complex piece of machinery with fuel injection and a single-stage two-speed supercharger, using water methanol injection to aid the supercharger in giving the Ki-84 a rated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial testing showed promise, with prototypes reaching 387 miles per hour in level flight, and later claims of up to 427 miles per hour under ideal conditions with high-octane fuel and perfect engine tuning. However, the reality of late-war Japanese production told a dramatically different story, one of declining quality, desperate improvisation, and systemic failure. Pilots and crews in the field learned to take care with the plane's high-maintenance Nakajima Homar engine and landing gear, prone to buckling at the worst possible moments. The Homar engine, while theoretically powerful and advanced, suffered from chronic reliability problems that worsened as quality control collapsed. The engine required precise tolerances that Japanese factories, under constant B-29 bombardment and lacking quality steel and aluminum, could no longer maintain. Many landing gear units were compromised by the poor quality heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, often containing impurities that made proper hardening impossible. As a result, many Hayates suffered strut collapses on landing, writing off aircraft that Japan could not afford to lose and killing pilots that took months to train. The disparity in production quality reflected the broader industrial crisis facing Japan, a nation that had gambled everything on a short war and lost. While American factories maintained consistent quality standards despite massive production volumes, actually improving quality as production techniques were refined, Japanese manufacturing deteriorated precipitously. Progressive deterioration in quality control meant that pilots never knew how individual aircraft would perform, whether the brakes would work, whether the engine would hold together at high power settings, and even whether they would be able to climb high enough to intercept B-29 superfortresses cruising at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3,514 Ki-84s total, and many of these were grounded due to lack of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those that were operational, perhaps half could be considered truly combat-ready at any given time. The fuel situation alone revealed the strategic catastrophe facing Japan, a nation that had gone to war partly to secure oil resources. While American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from refineries in Texas and California, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal. Late-war Japanese aviation fuel often tested at 87 octane or lower, sometimes as low as 80 octane, robbing engines of power and causing pre-ignition that destroyed cylinders, pistons and valves. Some desperate units attempted to supplement their fuel with pine root oil extracted from pine stumps, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even sake production byproducts, further degrading engine performance and reliability. Pilots reported engines that would barely start, ran rough at all power settings, and often failed catastrophically in flight. On that first April 7th mission, the Mustangs formed up with their charges, 103 Boeing B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing, each carrying tons of incendiary bombs destined for Japanese industrial targets. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron recalled, "It was a real spectacle. The 29ths were just finishing their assembly in a grand circle as we arrived. The sun glinted off their aluminum skin, and they looked like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky. The rendezvous itself represented a triumph of navigation and planning that would have been impossible without American technological advantages. The P-51s had flown 750 miles over open ocean, navigating primarily by dead reckoning and basic radio compass, timing their arrival to match the bomber's schedule within minutes. They had climbed gradually from sea level to 25,000 feet, their engines automatically adjusting mixture as they climbed, their superchargers seamlessly transitioning from low to high blower to maintain power. Crossing the coast of Honshu, the P-51 pilots dropped their 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they began to spot the first head-on feints from a force of more than 100 Japanese interceptors scrambling from multiple airfields around Tokyo. The silver drop tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in the morning sun, some exploding as they hit the ground, others bouncing across rice paddies. The Japanese pilots, flying a mixed force of Ki-84s, Ki-43s, Ki-44s, Ki-61s, and Navy fighters, including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shidenkai, experienced their first shock. These were not Navy carrier fighters with limited range, but land-based fighters that had somehow reached the homeland from bases they knew were impossibly distant. Flight Sergeant Takeo Tanimizu, flying a Ki-84 with the 56th Sentai, later recalled his disbelief. When we were scrambled, we were told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We thought it must be a mistake. Perhaps they meant enemy bombers. When I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. It was impossible. Our commanders had assured us that no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. Yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment, I knew the war was truly lost. Major James B. Tapp, later to become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was one of the first Mustang pilots to tear into a formation of Japanese fighters. His combat report, written hours after the mission, described the engagement with clinical precision. They came at us in the traditional 3-plane Shotai formation, but their coordination was poor. The flight leader would commit to an attack, but his wingmen often failed to follow through. They seemed hesitant, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, or simply inexperienced. We dove through them with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and Zoom climbed back to altitude before they could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination reflected the crisis in pilot training that had reached catastrophic proportions. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as little as 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, compared to the 600 hours American pilots received before deploying to combat theaters. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to their Iwo Jima base, the Sunsetters of 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese planes destroyed, 1 probable and 5 damaged, at a cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio on this first mission would only improve as American pilots gained experience over Japan, and Japanese pilot quality continued to deteriorate. Within weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become common, reflecting not just American superiority, but Japanese desperation. The performance differential between the aircraft became starkly apparent in combat, particularly in the vertical dimension where air combat was increasingly fought. The P-51D's superiority was particularly evident above 20,000 feet, the altitude where most interceptions took place. At these altitudes, the Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power while Japanese engines struggled for breath. The first stage compressed the thin air, cooled it through an intercooler, then fed it to the second stage for further compression, delivering dense, oxygen-rich air to the cylinders. The Ki-84's single-stage supercharger, lacking an intercooler and second stage, caused power to drop off dramatically above 20,000 feet, reducing its speed advantage and climb rate precisely where most interceptions occurred. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 could barely maintain 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D could still achieve 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellin of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who would fly the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan, described a typical engagement with vivid detail. We'd spot them climbing up to meet us, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled their throttles, but by 25,000 feet they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, probably running too rich because their superchargers couldn't provide enough air. We'd dive through their formation with our 650s blazing, the tracers looking like laser beams, and they simply couldn't match our speed in the dive or our zoom climb afterward. Our Merlins would sing as we pulled up, G-forces crushing us into our seats, while their radials would cough and sputter, struggling to maintain power. The P-51D could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining control authority, its laminar flow wings remaining effective even in the transonic regime, whereas Japanese fighters often experienced control reversal or structural failure at speeds above 400 miles per hour in a dive, their control surfaces blanking out or their wings simply tearing off. The contrast in pilot quality was devastating and grew worse with each passing day. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima typically had 400 to 600 hours of flight time, including 100+ hours in type, dozens of hours of gunnery practice, and extensive combat training against experienced instructors flying captured enemy aircraft or accurate simulations. They had practiced formation flying until it was second nature, instrument navigation in all weather conditions, deflection shooting at towed targets, and combat tactics developed from 3 years of air warfare experience. Japanese pilots in 1945 often had less than 100 hours total time, sometimes as little as 30 hours, with minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, no instrument training, and combat tactics learned from manuals rather than experienced instructors who were all dead or flying combat missions themselves. The navigation challenge alone separated the capable from the doomed, the living from the soon-to-be dead. Flying single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile round trips over a vast ocean with minimal navigation aids required a confidence born of experience and trust in both machine and support systems. American pilots flew with detailed weather briefings compiled from submarine weather reports and reconnaissance flights, accurate maps updated from photo reconnaissance, and functioning instruments manufactured to precise specifications. They had rescue submarines stationed along their route, Lifeguard League submarines that saved dozens of downed airmen and could rely on Dumbo PBY Catalina flying boats to rescue them if forced down. Japanese pilots increasingly flew with outdated maps that didn't show recent bomb damage, unreliable compasses that hadn't been properly swung, and no hope of rescue if downed over water. Their life rafts, if they had them at all, often leaked, and their emergency rations had usually been consumed during food shortages on the ground. The magnetic variation between Iwo and Tokyo in 1945 was 3 degrees west, and since Tokyo lay between the 139th and 140th meridians, while Iwo was between the 141st and 142nd, navigation was simplified to basic compass headings for the return flight, a fortunate geographic coincidence that saved many American lives. This geographic coincidence proved crucial when weather deteriorated or pilots became disoriented in combat, their compasses spinning wildly as they maneuvered. A pilot could simply fly south-southeast and know he would eventually see Iwo Jima's distinctive Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean, assuming he had enough fuel. The logistics supporting each force revealed the true nature of the Pacific Air War, a contest between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Every mission from Iwo Jima involved nearly 100 Mustangs consuming 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of C-50 caliber ammunition, plus bombs and rockets for ground attack missions. This represented just one day's operations from one base, and there were 3 fighter groups operating from Iwo Jima alone. Behind this stood a supply chain stretching back to factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, and ammunition plants in Missouri, all connected by Liberty ships, produced at a rate of 3 per day, and C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft that flew regular cargo routes across the Pacific. Ships arrived at Iwo Jima daily, unloading fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, mail, and 1,000 other items needed to keep a modern air force operational. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had collapsed into chaos and desperation. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were cancelled, leaving new pilots to face combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions, with pilots told to conserve rounds for only the most certain shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, never well coordinated even in the best of times, now competed desperately for dwindling resources like starving dogs fighting over scraps. Aircraft were cannibalized for spare parts until they were nothing but aluminum skeletons, and entire fighter groups were grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some units attempted to manufacture their own spare parts in primitive workshops, with predictably poor results. The technological sophistication gap extended beyond the aircraft themselves to every aspect of operations. American pilots wore G-suits that prevented blackouts in high-G maneuvers by squeezing blood back to the brain, used standardized oxygen systems that functioned reliably above 30,000 feet with automatic flow regulation, and communicated via VHF radios with clear reception and multiple channels. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and repacked, their life rafts contained working radios and fresh supplies, and their survival kits included everything from morphine to fishing gear. Japanese pilots often flew without functioning radios. Their vacuum tube radios consumed precious battery power and rarely worked properly anyway. They used unreliable oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, leading to hypoxia and disorientation, and had no G-suits, limiting their ability to match American aggressive maneuvering without blacking out or suffering broken blood vessels in their eyes. On June 1, 1945, called Black Friday by the Mustang men, weather rather than enemy action proved the greatest threat, demonstrating that even American technology had limits. About 150 Mustangs en route to Osaka flew into a blinding frontal system that wasn't supposed to be there according to weather forecasts. 27 aircraft were lost in minutes, with 24 losses due to weather, pilots becoming disoriented in towering cumulus clouds, flying into each other, or simply running out of fuel while trying to find clear air. This disaster illustrated that even for the technologically superior Americans, The very long-range missions pushed men and machines to their absolute limits. The weather front extended from sea level to 40,000 feet, with violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported St. Elmo's fire dancing on their wings, compasses spinning uselessly, and artificial horizons tumbling as their gyroscopes gave up trying to make sense of the violent motion. The impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who survived the war, wrote in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were told the B-29s were vulnerable without escort, that their fighters could never reach so far. Now we see Mustangs over the palace itself, strafing our airfields in broad daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. How can we defend the Emperor when the enemy's fighters roam freely over the sacred homeland? The sight of those Mustangs with their invasion stripes, so confident, so numerous, tells us what our leaders will not. The war is lost, and we are simply waiting to die." VLR missions were a test of flying skill, said Major Tapp in a post-war interview. Battling Japanese fighter pilots caused your adrenaline to flow, but getting from point A to point B was the hardest part. The ocean was endless, featureless, hypnotic. You'd check your compass constantly, wondering if it was wrong, if you'd somehow gotten turned around. The physical and mental strain was enormous and cumulative. Pilots stayed strapped into their cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, unable to stretch, unable to relieve themselves except into a relief tube that often froze at altitude. They dealt with cramping legs that felt like they were being stabbed with needles, numb buttocks that made them wonder if they'd ever walk again, and the constant anxiety of flying a single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of empty ocean where one mechanical failure meant almost certain death. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics, refined through 3 years of combat experience and thousands of pilot reports, proved superior to Japanese designs in every measurable way. The P-51D featured a bubble canopy providing 360-degree visibility. Pilots could actually look behind them by turning their heads, a life-saving capability in combat. The seat was fully adjustable for pilots of different heights. The rudder pedals could be moved to accommodate different leg lengths, and controls were positioned for minimum pilot fatigue during long missions. The instrument panel was logically arranged with the most important instruments, airspeed, altitude, engine gauges, directly in the pilot's line of sight. The Ki-84's cockpit, while an improvement over earlier Japanese fighters like the Zero, still suffered from poor visibility to the rear, due to structural members and the fuel tank behind the pilot's head, awkwardly placed controls that required pilots to take their hands off the stick at critical moments, and instruments that were difficult to read in combat conditions, especially when pulling Gs or when vibration from the engine made everything blur. Armament differences proved decisive in combat outcomes, often determining who lived and who died in the split-second encounters that characterized air combat. The P-51D's 6.50 caliber machine guns, while seemingly less impressive than the Ki-84's mixed cannon armament, offered crucial advantages that combat experience had proven decisive. The American guns were extraordinarily reliable, with stoppage rates below 1% when properly maintained, which they always were thanks to dedicated armament specialists. They carried far more ammunition, 1,880 to 2,080 rounds total compared to the Ki-84's 400 rounds for its cannon and machine guns combined. This meant American pilots could afford to take ranging shots, could engage multiple targets, and didn't have to worry about running out of ammunition after a few seconds of firing. The ballistics of the .50 caliber rounds were so well understood that American pilots could reliably engage targets at 400 yards, while Japanese pilots with mixed cannon and machine gun armament struggled with convergence zones and different ballistic trajectories, their cannon rounds dropping differently than their machine gun rounds, making accurate shooting nearly impossible beyond close range. The training difference in gunnery was even more pronounced. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds in training, learning to lead targets, to estimate range, to fire in short bursts to avoid overheating their guns. They practiced on towed sleeves, on camera guns, and in mock dogfights until deflection shooting became instinctive. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds in training, if that. Ammunition was too precious to waste on training when it was needed for combat. Many went into their first combat having never fired their guns at all, trying to learn deflection shooting while someone was trying to kill them. The Sunsetter's last aerial combat occurred near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when the 15th and 506th Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills in what would be one of the last air battles of World War II. By this point, Japanese resistance had become almost token, a shadow of the force that had once swept across the Pacific. Fuel shortages meant most Japanese fighters were grounded, their tanks drained to provide fuel for kamikaze aircraft. Those that did fly were often piloted by teenagers with minimal training, boys who had been in high school just months before. In all, Iwo's Mustangs were credited with 206 Japanese airplanes shot down between April and August 1945, 75% of the Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The actual number was probably higher, as many Japanese aircraft shot down over Japan were never confirmed, their wreckage lost in forests or urban areas. The strategic impact extended far beyond aerial victories to reshape the entire Pacific War. The presence of P-51s over Japan meant B-29s could bomb in daylight with greater accuracy, systematically destroying Japan's industrial infrastructure. Japanese industrial production, already crippled by material shortages, and B-29 night raids, ground to a halt under precision daylight bombing. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Japanese civilians could see American fighters strafing airfields in broad daylight, shooting up trains, attacking shipping in Tokyo Bay, making clear that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. The myth of the divine wind that would protect Japan was shattered when American fighters flew over the Imperial Palace itself. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 457th Fighter Squadron conducted several photo reconnaissance missions over Japan in a specially modified P-51D with cameras in place of guns. His reports revealed the extent of Japanese aviation collapse. We'd fly over airfields that intelligence said had hundreds of aircraft. We'd find maybe a dozen flyable planes. The rest were derelicts. No engines, no propellers, some just shells cannibalized for parts. They'd push wrecks around to make it look like they had more operational aircraft for our photo interpreters, but we could tell the difference between a real airplane and a hulk. Some airfields had fake wooden aircraft, complete with painted markings, trying to draw our attacks away from real planes hidden in revetments or under camouflage. The industrial mathematics were irrefutable and told the story of the war in stark numbers. The United States produced 15,586 P-51s of all variants during the war, more than Japan's total production of all aircraft types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan managed to produce approximately 3,500 Ki-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids and carrier strikes, lost in training accidents due to poor quality control, or grounded for lack of parts. American production lines were hitting their stride just as Japanese production collapsed. North American aviation alone was producing 20 P-51s per day at peak production, more than Japan produced Ki-84s in a month. Each American aircraft was essentially identical, with interchangeable parts, while Japanese aircraft varied wildly in quality and performance, even within the same production batch. The training pipeline told a similar story of overwhelming American advantage. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 pilots annually, each receiving 200 to 300 hours of flight instruction before advanced fighter training, then another 100 hours of combat training. Japan's pilot training program had essentially collapsed, with new pilots receiving perhaps 50 hours before being sent to operational units, often much less. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. America could replace losses while maintaining quality. Japan could not replace losses even with dramatically reduced standards. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 10, and the American pilots were far better prepared. Fuel consumption revealed the strategic endgame in stark detail. Each P-51 mission from Iwo Jima consumed approximately 600 gallons of 100-octane fuel per aircraft, internal fuel plus drop tanks. With 100 aircraft per mission and daily operations, this meant 60,000 gallons per day for one fighter group alone. American tankers delivered millions of gallons monthly to Pacific bases, a river of fuel flowing across the Pacific. Japan, meanwhile, was attempting to extract aviation fuel from pine roots, requiring 200 pine stumps to produce 1 gallon of barely usable fuel, and converting training aircraft to kamikaze weapons, because they lacked fuel for conventional operations. By August 1945, Japan had less than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel remaining in the home islands, enough for perhaps one major operation. The technological revolution represented by the P-51D went beyond mere performance statistics to embody an entire philosophy of warfare. The aircraft embodied American industrial philosophy, mass production with quality control, standardization across manufacturers, and continuous improvement based on combat feedback. Every P-51D that rolled off the production line was essentially identical, with interchangeable parts and predictable performance. A pilot could climb into any P-51D and know exactly how it would fly, exactly where every switch and instrument would be. Japanese aircraft, increasingly hand-built with variable quality materials and substitute components, showed wide performance variations even within the same production batch. One Ki-84 might be capable of 400 miles per hour, while another from the same factory might struggle to exceed 350 miles per hour due to manufacturing variations. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, commander of 7th Fighter Command, would later write, "I don't believe there is any question about the P-51 being the best prop fighter of World War II. It was our top air fighter, and hence best for escort missions and equal to the P-47 as an attacker against ground targets." This assessment reflected not just the aircraft's performance, but its reliability, maintainability, and adaptability to the extreme demands of very long-range operations. The P-51 could be refueled and rearmed in 30 minutes, could fly twice a day if needed, and could operate from rough coral runways that would have destroyed more delicate aircraft. The maintenance statistics were telling and revealed another dimension of American superiority. P-51Ds at Iwo Jima maintained an operational rate above 80%, despite the harsh conditions, volcanic dust that got into everything, salt air that corroded aluminum, and minimal facilities that meant most maintenance was performed outdoors. Ground crews could perform engine changes in 4 hours using mobile cranes and standardized procedures, and battle damage that would ground a Japanese fighter for weeks could be repaired overnight using prefabricated parts flown in from the States. The Ki-84, even when fuel and ammunition were available, suffered from serviceability rates below 40%, sometimes as low as 20%. The complex Homar engine required specialized tools that often didn't exist, trained technicians who were mostly dead or drafted into combat units, and spare parts that had to be hand-fitted because manufacturing tolerances were so poor. Weather reconnaissance provided another crucial advantage that saved countless American lives. Dedicated B-29s flew weather reconnaissance missions hours before fighter operations, reporting cloud conditions, wind speeds, and frontal systems. These weatherbirds provided detailed meteorological data that helped plan routes around the worst weather, though as Black Friday showed, weather could still surprise even the best prepared missions. Japanese forces, lacking such capabilities, often flew blind into weather that destroyed entire formations. The American ability to predict and avoid weather fronts reduced operational losses significantly, while Japanese units suffered catastrophic weather-related losses that exceeded combat casualties. The communication infrastructure supporting American operations was revolutionary for its time. High-frequency radio beacons transmitted from submarines and island bases, submarine-based rescue coordination that could vector search aircraft to downed pilots, and real-time weather updates created a safety network that gave pilots confidence to push the extreme range capabilities of their aircraft. The psychological value of knowing that if you went down, someone would come looking for you cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots, often flying with no working radio and no hope of rescue if forced down, faced each mission with fatalistic acceptance of probable death. Their farewell ceremonies before missions were literal. They expected never to return. Captain Harry C. Krim Jr. of the 531st Fighter Squadron, who would become an ace over Japan with 7 victories, observed the strategic reality with brutal clarity. We owned the sky over Japan. We could go where we wanted, when we wanted. The Japanese knew it, we knew it, and most importantly, Japanese civilians knew it. Every P-51 over Tokyo was proof that Japan had lost the war. We weren't fighting for air superiority anymore. We had it. We were just demonstrating it, rubbing their noses in it, showing them that resistance was futile. The very long-range missions fundamentally changed the strategic equation in the Pacific, rendering all previous calculations obsolete. No longer could Japan rely on distance to protect the home islands, the tyranny of distance that had protected them for centuries. The industrial heartland that had survived relatively untouched for 3 years of war was now exposed to daily attack. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo shattered the last illusions about Japan's ability to defend itself, destroyed the myth of the divine wind, and made clear that defeat was not just possible, but inevitable. The human cost reflected the technological disparity in cruel mathematical terms. Between July 1st and August 15th, 1945, fully 85 American fighter pilots lost their lives on VLR missions, but only a handful were claimed in air-to-air combat, perhaps 5 or 6. Most losses were operational: weather, mechanical failure, navigation errors, or simple exhaustion causing pilots to make fatal mistakes. Japanese pilot losses in the same period numbered in the hundreds, perhaps over 1,000, with entire squadrons eliminated in futile attempts to intercept American formations. The 47th Sentai, which had started April with 40 operational pilots, had just 3 remaining by August. The 244th Sentai was completely destroyed, reformed with new pilots, and destroyed again. The last dogfights over Japan revealed the final collapse of Japanese air power as an organized force. On August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan due to the international dateline, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin flew what would be the last combat mission of the war. Taking off from Iwo Jima with his wingman, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, they attacked airfields near Nagoya. The mission had been planned before word of Japan's surrender reached the field, and the code word Utah that would have recalled them never reached their radios. Yellin and Schlamberg strafed their targets and turned for home, banking into a cloud formation to escape anti-aircraft fire. When Yellin emerged from the clouds, Schlamberg was gone, shot down by ground fire to become the last American combat death of World War II. Even in defeat, with the war literally ending, and the Emperor having already recorded his surrender broadcast, Japanese anti-aircraft positions continued firing with desperate determination. But notably absent were Japanese fighters. They had essentially ceased to exist as an effective force, grounded by lack of fuel, lack of pilots, or simply destroyed. The mathematics of the air war were final and irrefutable, written in aluminum and blood across the skies of Japan. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440 mile/hour top speed, 2,000-mile range with drop tanks, and 6 reliable machine guns with nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, had rendered the Japanese home islands defenseless against daylight air attack. The Ki-84 Hayate, despite its theoretical capabilities and the courage of its pilots, never had the numbers, reliability, or pilot quality to mount an effective defense. It was not a contest between equals, but a foregone conclusion, the result determined by factories in Detroit and oil wells in Texas as much as by combat over Tokyo. American industrial might, expressed through the magnificent P-51 Mustang, had achieved what naval blockade and island hopping could not: the complete elimination of Japan's ability to defend its airspace. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without fighter escort, not because none was available, but because none was needed. Japanese fighter opposition had been swept from the skies, crushed by the overwhelming superiority of American technology, training, and production. Out of 3,514 Ki-84s built, only one survives today. It sits in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, a solitary reminder of Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive in museums and private collections worldwide, many still flying at air shows, their Merlin engines singing the song of American industrial triumph 7 decades after they first appeared in the skies over Tokyo. The disparity in surviving aircraft tells its own story. American aircraft were built to last, maintained with care, and valued as historical artifacts. Japanese aircraft were built for immediate use, expected to be destroyed in combat, and treated as expendable. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo was more than tactical surprise. It was the stunning realization that American industrial capacity and technological advancement had made even the impossible routine. single-engine fighters flying 1,500-mile combat missions, arriving with enough fuel to fight for 2 hours, and returning safely to base. This was beyond Japanese comprehension or capability. The P-51D Mustang over Mount Fuji was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of American industrial supremacy, technological innovation, and the inexorable mathematics of total war. The lesson was clear and brutal. In modern industrial warfare, superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. The P-51D Mustang represented American industry at its peak. 15,000-plus aircraft produced with consistent quality, flown by well-trained pilots, supported by unlimited logistics, and deployed with strategic precision. Against this, Japan's Ki-84 Hayate, despite individual courage and occasional tactical success, stood no chance. The shock of American fighters over Tokyo was, ultimately, the shock of mathematical reality. A reality that ended with atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, delivered by B-29s that no longer needed fighter escort because Japanese air power had ceased to exist. The Mustangs had done their job with ruthless efficiency. They had proven that distance was no defense, that industrial might trumped warrior spirit, and that technological superiority, properly applied, was insurmountable. The Japanese pilots who faced them in those final months learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Courage alone cannot overcome the mathematics of industrial production, technological advancement, and logistical supremacy. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo was proof that the age of the samurai had ended, replaced by the age of the production line, the supercharger, and the very long-range fighter escort. The divine wind had been conquered by science, the warrior spirit broken by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.